Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much. This is an incredible pleasure for me to have Dr. Hussein Ibish here today. In short, he's a national treasure. And I just want to give you a little anecdote about the kind of guy he is. One day in his week, he's taking my kid around Washington, D.C. to the National Archives to show him the Constitution and Magna Carta, and then the National Gallery of Art. And later on, he's introducing Hillary Clinton at a function, an evening function on Middle East affairs. I'm going to have to read you his background because it's so extensive. And we can't be sure. He's a senior research fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine in Washington, D.C., and executive director of the Hala Salam Maqsood Foundation for Arab American Leadership. Dr. Ibish has been in literally thousands of media venues. I have stopped counting his public speaking and media venues at 30 countries, but it's got to be more. It's got to be more. Just it is more, but I had to pick up the kids from school and take them to dinner. He has been seen and have op-eds in newspapers around the world, including the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and most recently he co-authored a 2,300-word op-ed in the New York Times. And if you know anything about the New York Times, not only is it difficult to get published there, but 800 is usually the limit. So he's particularly erudite. I don't think so. I resemble that remark. In any event, because of breaking news in the Middle East, he actually turned down a slew of live news interviews for today just to be here with us, including the O'Reilly Factor, which we might be doing you a favor. I happen to like being on the O'Reilly Factor myself, but he can be a tough interlocutor, but I think he likes us. But in any event, I happen to enjoy being on the Factor, so anytime they call him, I've been going. But he's the editor and principal author of 3 major studies of hate crime and discrimination against Arab Americans from 1998 to 2007. He's the author of At Constitution's Edge, Arab Americans and Civil Liberties in the United States, and in States of Confinement is another book by St. Martin's Press. He has another book, Anti-Arab Bias in American Policy and Discourse in Race in the 21st Century. We could go on and on and on. He's got a ton of them. He's also an author of a book about the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and he's been playing a key role in that, in particular with regard to conciliation. He also, I think, is noteworthy for the following reasons. He has been an indefatigable warrior against prejudice, particularly interreligious prejudice. And I'm going to say this in different languages. Why? Because sometimes you get letters saying, why don't you say this in Arabic? Which he does. He has criticized anti-Christian bigotry and hate crime in the Middle East. He has criticized anti-Semitism all over the world, including on California college campuses. And he has been one of the most eloquent voices against the scourge of Islamophobia, which has occurred not only around the world, but unfortunately here in the United States. He is truly someone who combines both passion, a heart, and brilliance in one package. As I said, a national treasure. The title of his lecture today is Islam and Islamophobia in a Changing World. He's going to speak, then I will ask him maybe about 5 questions, and then we'll throw it out to the audience. Only one follow-up, please. And just be respectful, he'll answer anything you like. But I think we're getting him at an incredible time. And I told him we're not going to invite him back because whenever he comes here, something monumental happens in the world, and we have him here to talk about it. Today there is news out of Egypt. We also had hearings on Capitol Hill. We also have a conservative conference in Washington, D.C., where there are some controversial speakers. Controversial as being quite charitable, controversial speakers there. So you couldn't get a more expert analyst covering one of the most urgent news stories of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to introduce not only a dear colleague, but a true friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hussein Ibish. Oh, one last thing, I forgot. He's on the board of our center, the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, who is also the sponsor of this talk today. And, I would be remiss, he has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So I did get that into your alma mater. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a hearty Cal State welcome to Dr. Hussein Ibish.
Yes, the literature degree means if you really want to talk about Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Kidd and Donne, we could do that, or about that. But really, I came here with the intention of talking about Islamophobia and, in a way, also a little bit about Islam as a factor in global politics. Although that's really a topic you could not fit into a single lecture. Because it's so huge. But I've been sort of asked to also look a little bit at the situation in Egypt, and I'm going to do that just a little bit, because it really is extremely exciting and interesting, and potentially transformative. Just to bring you up to speed, I mean, there have been 3 weeks of very intensive protests in Egypt that have been calling for the ouster of President Mubarak, and he's been insisting he won't go. And there are many powerful indications that today is his last day. The army has said they've secured the country. The protesters have been told their demands have been met. There's supposedly a speech by President Mubarak, although it's becoming early morning there, so if he was going to talk, he seems to be taking his time. But that happened last time as well. I mean, last time they made people wait until very long before coming out with one of the more pathetic speeches we've heard in a long time, probably sank him permanently when he gave that talk. Leon Panetta, who's the head of the CIA, has told the Congress today in a hearing that this is it, he's gone. And that seems to be where the Obama administration both thinks it's going and also wants it to go. And we haven't heard from him yet, so we don't really know. But it looks like, my own view was that last week he was 4/5 out the door. And I'd say now he's like 98% out the door, but still there's fingernails hanging onto the hinges here, I think the problem with the situation in Egypt overall is that what most audiences and producers and editors and readers and viewers want is a bunch of things that no serious commentator should provide. First of all, a detailed political analysis. And the reason no one should provide that is this is a fundamentally unreadable political situation. I don't know who the political actors are. Nobody does, because the main powers that are moving here are not political actors. There are political actors, Mubarak and his cronies on the one side, opposition political groups, the Muslim Brothers, some of these youth groups, various different opposition factions. Those are political actors, but right now they don't seem to have any major political force behind them. Right? The political forces are not political actors, and I want to try to explain what I mean by that. You've got these hundreds of thousands of people, day in and day out, in Tahrir Square and the other major places in the big cities in Egypt, but they don't have a clear ideology. They don't have a leadership. They don't have, their message specifically is no Mubarak and no to Mubarak's son. Well, that's clear. And generally, they seem to want elections. There's a whole other side, by the way, to their message, which is really interesting, which I'll come to, but again, it's sort of both above and below politics. It's not a clear political agenda. And no forces, no opposition forces, and nobody who put themselves forward as a putative leader has been embraced by the crowds, by any manner of means. So you have basically got this massive political force that is not a political actor, it doesn't have an agenda, and that unless and until a political structure with a clear agenda and an ideology took the momentum that the popular protests have generated and translated them into a political movement, you have a situation where This is a political force without being a political actor. And I think the same more or less applies to the army, by the way. Also a massive political force, sort of in a way on the other side. But they wouldn't choose between the demonstrators and Mubarak, and they've done their best not to choose. And I think one of the reasons is it's probably true that the general staff is very sympathetic to President Mubarak. He's a former general. He appointed them. I mean, they're not there randomly. They're there because of him. But they would have to be very concerned about how an order to suppress the crowd, Tiananmen style, would go down with the field commanders and certainly with the rank and file. I mean, this is a very large and popular army in Egypt, and the idea that the troops on the ground have a very different perspective than the protesters do, and they all seem to come from the same basic, where enough of them come from this large urban, underemployed urban middle class section of Egyptian society that they would probably share a lot of the same views. And so the idea of actually suppressing the protesters with force is not one that the army wanted to engage in and has avoided it. So again, kind of wanting to be and remain apolitical in a certain sense. And that's the great conundrum. Now, what's really interesting, and here's where it ties, where the Egyptian protest movement ties into the question of Islam as a political force in the world today, is that what's fascinating is that the Egyptian protests are not Islamic in any meaningful sense. They're not Islamist anyway, certainly. The largest and most important opposition party in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, is an Islamist party. Really not involved, as far as one can tell, in organizing the protests. Certainly the rhetorical, the narrative structure, and the sort of semiotic landscape of the protests, the symbolic language of the protest is not Islamist and it's not Islamic. It's nationalistic, it's ecumenical, it's secular, and it's very, very different than anything you might have expected to be generated by a group like the Muslim Brotherhood. And there have been reports of people trying to lead the crowds in sort of Islamist chants or very religious chants, and sort of being shouted down. Now, people are praying publicly, and the Christians are protecting the Muslims while they pray, and the Muslims are protecting the Christians while they pray, and it's very ecumenical and whatnot. Well, of course, because Egyptians are a devout and religious people, so that's not surprising at all. But that public prayer does not is part of, first of all, the culture, and secondly, it's also part of a very complicated psychological game that the protesters were playing with the regime, especially pitting the army against the government and the police. And it's part and parcel of the whole sort of keeping the protests non-violent, keeping them ecumenical and secular, and welcoming the troops when they came into the streets, not the police, but the army, hugging them, giving them flowers, giving them tea, bringing them into the soccer tournaments they organized in Tahrir Square, basically treating them like friends, or perhaps slightly estranged relatives, but definitely not treating them as the enemy. This is extremely smart, because it really, I think, helped to offset any possibility that the troops would agree to be used the way that the Chinese troops who were sent into Tiananmen Square, who came from a completely different segment of Chinese society, mostly rural villagers, kids, being sent in against the children of the elite in Tiananmen Square, basically. And there wasn't a fellow feeling, and that was pretty obvious by the way they conducted themselves and accepted the order to clear the square with, by any means necessary. In this case, you haven't seen anything like that. Now, I don't want to overstate things, because by no means do we know how this is going to play itself out. I've been extremely fed up listening to all kinds of commentaries that try to do detailed analysis that I said you shouldn't do, even worse, prognostications and predictions. That's absurd. Anyone who comes up with things like that should be, not bothered with in the future by any one of you, because it's a fundamentally unreadable situation. So you can't do a thoroughgoing political analysis of what's going on. And as for prognostication, it's completely impossible. Right? I don't have a crystal ball, and I have no idea what's going to happen there. But let's say this. one of the noteworthy things about the character, the nationalistic, secular, and ecumenical character of the protests, is precisely that they haven't fallen into a pattern of Islamist or religious right-wing Muslim rhetoric at all. Okay, they've actually avoided it. And the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has not overplayed its hand. They're conducting themselves in an intelligent way. They know they're not in a position to claim leadership in this movement. So they're deliberately going out of their way not to claim leadership in the movement so that they don't alienate people who they don't have much influence over even further by claiming that they're in charge when everyone knows they're not. And this is hedging their bets in an intelligent way, but what it shows is that they really are on the sidelines here, and they have the smartest thing for them to do is to accept that, live with it for the meanwhile, and look for opportunities to get in. And they've tried, but they haven't really found too much space today. This is essentially the sudden re-emergence of a sensibility that has been politically dormant in the Arab world for quite some time. And I mean Arab nationalism. I don't mean Nasserite Arab pan-nationalism, the idea that the Arabs should unite in a single country or big chunks of it should unite. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a political sensibility that puts the ethnic Arab identity at the forefront. Not the religious Muslim identity or anything, or a sub-national identity or anything like that. But no, the national identity, in this case the Egyptian identity, and very much with an Arab veneer over it. And that's what's giving it its power regionally. It's other Arabs in other Arab countries looking at it and saying, this is a model that we can go forward with. There's nothing before this protest movement, except for maybe the Tunisian protest movement, which also is very new, that would have suggested that this latent, dormant force of nationalistic Arab sentiment specified to the countries in question would be suddenly re-erupt at the very end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011. If you had predicted what kind of political force, what kind of political rhetoric, what kind of sensibility would lead people into the streets, it would have been very hard not to predict that it would have had an Islamist tinge. So 6 months ago or 4 months ago and before that. But that's not what's happened. And in Tunisia, the main slogan of the demonstrators is really interesting and really instructive. The main slogan in Tunisia was Tunis huwa al-hal, which is Tunisia is the answer. It's specifically a rebuttal to the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood parties all over the Middle East, which is Islam huwa al-hal. Islam is the answer, or Islam has the answers. We can translate it either way. They put Tunisia in the place of Islam, not because they're not Muslim, not because they're being blasphemous, they're not. But what they're saying is, Tunisia is our political guideline. This is a nationalist movement, right? Not a religious movement. It's not a repudiation of faith. It's not an atheist slogan or an agnostic slogan or anything like that. But what it is a sudden eruption of non-religious nationalist sentiment. And you can see that in Tahrir Square also with the ecumenical nature of it, the Muslim-Christian thing that's going on. And also that there is a solid presence of Muslim Brotherhood style people in the protests. It's not like the Muslim Brothers haven't told their folks to go out and be there. You can see that there's a significant chunk of the protesters who are of the very conservative religious bent, and they're participating in an ecumenical fashion along with everybody else. So they're not being excluded, but they're not defining it either. And they don't seem to be either bothered by standing next to young guys drinking beers or standing next to a Christian mass or anything like that. So it's really an interesting and unexpected thing. Now, as I said, I don't want to overstate it, and I certainly wouldn't begin to talk about an Arab nationalist sentiment starting to eclipse an Islamist sentiment as the principal opposition force in the Arab world. But if things go relatively well in Egypt, it will be a model that will be very difficult to contain. The power of Egypt to influence the rest of the Arab world cannot be underestimated. The only places where there's some inherent insulation from that influence would be in some of the Gulf states where there are not that many people and a lot of money. So you don't have to worry. I mean, Kuwait just celebrated its national days and they gave every citizen 1,000 KD, which is like $4,000. I mean, you can give people $4,000 as a happy birthday gift. There's not going to be any revolutions. That's as simple as that. I mean, no one's going to go screaming in the streets because they're pissed off they just got $4,000 as an April Fool's surprise. So they're probably like not going to be overthrown. And I think also, in all seriousness, the fragmented social nature of Iraq and Lebanon make it unlikely that they would also sort of repeat in the Egyptian scenario. Plus, they have very different systems and whatnot. But I think other Arab states have to be very, very concerned, and people's excited about the potential for the Egyptian model spurring either similar protest movements or just forcing governments to engage in reforms that they have avoided in order to avoid that. I mean, you can see the Jordanians scrambling to get ahead of the ball and just like terrified that the wave may be coming, you know, dismissing the government and all these and bringing in reforms. They're trying to get ahead of the ball. The Palestinians have local elections on July 9, which is about time. Hamas has said they won't participate. That's fine. They're local elections, so it doesn't reify the difference between Gaza and the West Bank. It's okay. You can have them just in the West Bank if that's the only place that they participate. It's an improvement. So, what I really wanted to say about Islam as a political force in the Middle East is that it is and it has been for the past 20, 25 years political Islam, of an Islamist bent, especially Muslim Brotherhood bent, has been the principal opposition movement in all the Arab states. But when opposition has suddenly erupted at the popular level, it hasn't had, in the Egyptian case, an Islamist narrative, Islamist slogans, Islamist semiology to it, which is semiotics, which is very odd and unpredicted, and actually, I think, a source of a lot of hope, because in the end, these are heterogeneous societies that require governments that are even-handed on matters of faith, and theocracies rather don't really solve problems very effectively. So that's really where I wanted to sort of draw in the contemporary moment and Islam as a force in the world. And I think we can talk more about all kinds of different aspects of this. But I'd like to switch over